Hello everybody and welcome back to Anatomy 2 Assignment 3 video. My name is Jaden and I'd like to preface by saying that I lost my voice and am getting over tonsillitis, but I already wrote my script, so sorry in advance for having to listen to me talk like this for 30 minutes, but I hope that my analogies, videos, and mnemonics will make up for it. So today we're going to be talking about the GI tract, also known as the gastrointestinal tract, which is a series of hollow organs joined in a long twisted tube. It runs from your mouth to your anus, and it's separated into upper and lower tracts. So let's go through the organs in order from how your food passes from your mouth to your anus. So for starters, we have our esophagus. The esophagus is a hollow muscular tube that's connecting our throat to our stomach. Basically, it carries liquids and foods to be processed by the stomach, and it can be divided into the thoracic esophagus and your abdominal esophagus. And it's divided like this because each part gets blood differently. So, your thoracic esophagus gets blood from the aorta, bronchial arteries, the right intercostal arteries, and blood leaves from the esophageal veins, tongue twister, or the azygous veins. Now, your abdominal esophagus is going to get blood from the esophageal branches of the left inferior phrenic artery and left gastric artery, which are branches of the celiac trunk. And blood is going to leave through the left gastric vein through the portal venous system. So when it comes to lymphatic drainage, the thoracic esophagus is going to drain into three different parts. The first is your jugular trunk. The second is the bronchomediastinal trunk, and the third is your superior diaphragmatic nodes, which work their way into the trunks. So a little mnemonic I think of as Jess brings soup. And then your abdominal esophagus is going to drain into your celiac or abdominal nodes, so that one's pretty easy. So the last thing about the esophagus, how does it know what to do and when to do it? So it's innervated by parasympathetic and sympathetic neurons. And you'll see as we move on that all of the organs in your GI tract are innervated parasympathetically and sympathetically. So for each organ, we're going to go through both types of innervations. So for our esophagus, parasympathetic innervation is through the vagal trunks, and sympathetically, it's innervated by the thoracic sympathetic trunk to the greater splanchnic nerve. And it can also be a mix of parasympathetic and sympathetic innervation when it's innervated by the periarterial plexus around the left gastric artery and the left inferior phrenic artery. So as the esophagus goes from our mouth down to our chest, it has to get through the diaphragm. And this is done at an opening called the esophageal hiatus, which acts as a sphincter. This is also where the esophageal mucosa of the esophagus ends and the gastric mucosa of the stomach starts. So now on to the stomach. So the stomach's job is to digest food by secreting acid and enzymes and also contracting to churn the food. It's shaped like a J, and I have a picture here. And we're going to go through the different parts. So we have the yellow, which is our main body. Then we have the fundus in brown, which is the top part, and it's right beside the cardial notch right here. We also have the pylorus antrum here in purple. And it goes to the pylorus canal in pink. And basically, antrum is a wider section or a chamber, whereas canal is more narrow. So you can see that the purple is a little bit more wider since it's an antrum than the canal in pink. And then both of these connect to the duodenum here in green. And then also we have the cardia in orange here and the esophagus, which leads into the stomach here in blue. We also have the greater curvature and the lesser curvature. So when we're talking about the stomach, I'll probably be referring to the lesser and greater curvatures, so now you know where they are. So when we look at the interior of the stomach, we can see longitudinal gastric folds that are called rugae, and we can especially see the rugae along the greater curvature as we get closer to the pylorus. So when we swallow, these rugae form a temporary furrow called the gastric canal, and this facilitates the passage of saliva and fluids when we swallow. So when it comes to blood supply of the stomach, we can divide it by the different curvatures that I was talking about before. So the lesser curvature is supplied by anastomomes by the right and left gastric arteries, and the greater curvature is supplied by anastomomes of the right and left gastro-omental arteries. And the blood is going to leave through two different veins. So the first is the right and left gastric veins, and they run parallel to the arteries and drain into the hepatic portal system. Now the second vein that blood leaves through is the right and left gastro-omental veins. Lymph-wise, the drainage into the gastric and gastro-omental lymph nodes. And as said before, the stomach needs to contract to help digest the food. So the brain is going to tell it to do this through sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation. So parasympathetic innervation happens through the anterior vagal trunk, mainly left vagus nerve, and also the posterior vagal trunk, mainly the right vagus nerve. And sympathetically, it innervates the stomach through the T6 to T9 segments to the greater splanchnic nerve to the celiac plexus. And a mix of your SNS and PNS innervation comes from the periarterial plexus around the gastric and gastromental arteries. So, once the food gets to the pyloric canal, it's going to pass through the pylorus valve and enter the duodenum. So a bit about the duodenum: it is the first part of the small intestine, and it's going to further digest the food and absorb nutrients in water. So this is where we start to see the nutrients start to be absorbed. It gets blood proximally from the celiac trunk, gastroduodenal artery, and superior pancreaticoduodenal artery, long word. And it also gets blood distally from the supramesenteric artery and inferior pancreatic duodenal artery. And all of the blood will drain into the hepatic portal system. Now, the lymph is drained into two different nodes at the duodenum. The first is the pyloric lymph nodes, and this drains into the anterior lymph vessels. And the second is the superior mesenteric lymph nodes, and these are going to drain into the posterior lymph vessels. So, similar to the esophagus and the stomach, it is innervated by parasympathetic, sympathetic, and sometimes a mix of both. So parasympathetic innervation is going to come from the anterior and posterior vagal trunks, whereas sympathetic innervation is going to come from greater and lesser splanchnic nerve from celiac and superior mesenteric plexus. And both of these can innervate, and when this happens, it's from the periarterial plexus that is next to the pancreaticoduodenal arteries. Now, we said that the duodenum is the first little part of the small intestine, but what about the rest? So let's move on to the small intestine, which, duodenum aside, can be divided into two parts. The first is the jejunum, which is the midsection of the small intestine, and the ileum is the last part of the small intestine before the large intestine starts. So the jejunum starts at the duodenal junction, where it's held in place by the mesentery, and continues to become the ileum, and it's not very clear where this border is. So, now that I talked about the two parts, we're going to go through and compare them. So, first, the jejunum is the shorter part of the small intestine, and this is where we're going to be absorbing fully digested carbohydrates and proteins, specifically sugars, amino acids, and fatty acids. And then moving on to the ileum, this is going to be the longest part of the small intestine, and this is going to absorb all of the leftover particles that haven't been absorbed by the jejunum or duodenum, specifically vitamin B12 and bioacids that will be recycled throughout our body. So I always think that the jejunum sounds like jelly beans, and since it digests bigger particles like carbohydrates and proteins, and the ileum kind of sounds like yum, and yum since it eats up whatever's left. So the small intestine is going to get blood in an interesting way. So the jejunal ileal arteries branch off from the left side of the superior mesenteric artery, and they're going to form what are called arterial arcades, which is a network of arteries, and they lead to the vasa recta, which then lead to the straight arteries. And blood is going to leave through the superior mesenteric veins, which together with the splenic vein form the hepatic portal vein. In terms of lymph, the small intestine has a cool structure called lacteals, which are specialized lymphatic vessels in the intestinal villi that absorb fat and fat-soluble vitamins such as vitamin K, E, D, A, and a little mnemonic to remember the four vitamins that the small intestine absorb? It's keep every dolphin alive, so KEDA vitamins. In terms of innervation, again, we have the parasympathetic innervation, sympathetic, and a mix. So parasympathetically, it is innervated by the vagus nerve, synapses on neurons in the myenteric and submucous plexus in the intestinal wall, tongue twisters, and it gets its sympathetic innervation through the greater splanchnic nerve and the celiac plexus ganglia, also from the lesser splanchnic nerve and superior mesenteric plexus and ganglia. It's also innervated by a mix, as I said before, and this is innervated through the superior mesenteric artery, and its branches are innervated by the periarterial nerve plexuses surrounding the superior mesenteric artery. It's also important to note that there is sensory innervation to the small intestine, and this is through general visceral afferent fibers, which send pain or reflex impulses to the ileum and jejunum. So pain can be felt from distension, which is a gas buildup, aka when you feel bloated, or transient ischemia, which is colic, or when there is a block in your small intestine. So these are the two ways that we can feel pain in our small intestine. But also pain can be referred, meaning that you won't necessarily feel it in your small intestine, but you'll feel it somewhere else. And this happens with a couple of the organs in our GI tract, so we're going to touch on that a bit later as well. So after food goes through the small intestine, it's going to reach the large intestine at a structure called the cecum. So the cecum is sort of like a pouch that forms the first part of the large intestine, and this is where the appendix is attached to. So cecum sounds like C, and I remember that because the cecum is going to see the food first in the whole large intestine. It is a thick mucous membrane to absorb any leftover water and salt, and it mixes leftover contents with the mucus. So, like we talked about before, the esophagus is going to be delivering the food. The stomach is going to be kind of like packaging it, if we're going to think of like a mail delivery. And then the intestine and the large intestine is going to be where we're absorbing it. So the small intestine is going to absorb everything first, and once it gets to the large intestine, it's basically just taking in anything that is left. So, a bit about the large intestine. There are 6 different parts, and the second portion of the large intestine is the colon. But first of all, the 6 different parts. First is the ascending, second is the transverse, third is the descending, fourth is the sigmoid, fifth is the rectum, and sixth is the anal canal. A little mnemonic to remember is always travel down south rapid asteroids. Some major features of the large intestine are the tennae coli, which are thick bands of longitudinal muscle. Tendon is kind of like a thick band. The haustra, which are pouches, and these kind of sound like holster, which that's how I remember it. It's basically like a pouch that holds stuff, the haustra, just like how a holster holds a gun. And then we have the omental appendices, which are small fatty appendices, and caliber is basically the word that describes when there is a large diameter. So when we're talking about blood, it is important to note some major differences that the large intestine has from the small intestine. So while the small intestine gets blood from the branches of the superior mesenteric artery, the large intestine is going to get blood from branches of the superior and inferior mesenteric arteries. So small intestine is just superior, and large intestine is going to get from the superior and inferior. But for the most part, the superior mesenteric artery is going to supply to the structures on the right of the abdomen. So you can think about it, I'm a righty personally, so my right is superior, and that's how I think that superior goes to the right. And the inferior mesenteric artery is going to supply to structures on your left of the abdomen. And since I'm not a lefty, I say that my left is inferior, so inferior goes to the left. And when it comes to blood supply and innervation, each section of the large intestine is going to be a bit different. So let's go through it. For the cecum, blood is going to come from the ileocolic artery, which is a terminal branch of the superior mesenteric artery. For the appendix, blood is going to come from the appendicular artery, which is a terminal branch of the ileocolic artery. And both the cecum and the appendix are going to have venous drainage by the ileocolic vein, which drains into the superior mesenteric vein, and they're both innervated by the SNS through the lesser splanchnic nerve to the superior mesenteric plexus, and it's innervated by the PNS through the vagus nerve. Now, for the ascending colon and the right colic flexure, blood is going to come from the ileocolic and right colic arteries, which both branch off the superior mesenteric artery, and blood is going to leave through the ileocolic and right colic veins, where they're going to drain into the superior mesenteric vein. And both the ascending colon and the right colic fixture are going to be innervated by the SNS through the lesser splanchnic nerve to the superior mesenteric plexus, and innervated by the PNS through vagus nerves, and just vagus nerves. The transverse colon is going to get its blood from branches of the superior mesenteric artery, specifically the middle colic artery and the right-left colic arteries via anastosomes, and blood is going to leave from the superior mesenteric vein. SNS innervation is from the superior mesenteric plexus, and PNS innervation is from the vagus nerves. It could also be a mixed innervation. In this case, some nerves from the superior mesenteric plexus are going to follow right and middle colic arteries, while some nerves from the inferior mesenteric plexus are going to follow anastosomes from the left colic artery. And then, lastly, for the descending and the sigmoid colon, blood is going to come from the left colic and sigmoid arteries, branches of the inferior mesenteric artery. Collateral circulation is supplied by the marginal artery here. And blood is going to leave through the inferior mesenteric vein. It's going to go to the splenic vein, which is then going to go to the hepatic portal vein. And the descending and sigmoid colon are innervated by the SNS through lumbar splanchnic nerves to the inferior mesenteric ganglionic nerve. And PNS innervation is from the pelvic splanchnic nerves to the inferior hypogastric plexus. And there can be a mixed innervation through periarterial plexus on the inferior mesenteric artery and its branches. So, now that we talked about the organs that the food travels through, let's talk about some accessory organs that are going to help out with this process. So first we have the spleen. The spleen is an organ that's the size of around your fist, and it's in the upper left side of your abdomen next to your stomach. It's super important for the immune system because this is where your antibodies are produced. It also stores and filters blood, and it maintains levels of fluid in our body. It's actually not directly involved in digestion. However, it keeps your fluids in balance, which can impact how much water is absorbed by the large intestine. Fun fact, you can actually live without a spleen since your liver can take over many of its functions. The spleen is covered by a layer called the peritoneum, except at a structure called the hilum, which we kind of talked about in the last video, but the hilum is where splenic branches of splenic artery enter and leave. So there's also a splenorenal ligament connecting it to the left kidney, and a gastrosplenic ligament, and this is where it's connected to the posterior wall of the greater curvature. So two different types of ligaments. The spleen also receives blood from the splenic artery that's coming from the celiac trunk, and blood is going to leave through splenic veins. And it's important to note that the splenic vein then will join with the inferior mesenteric vein, which then joins with the superior mesenteric vein, forming the hepatic portal vein. And lastly, the spleen is innervated by the celiac plexus with distribution along the splenic artery. So, now onto the next accessory organ, we have the pancreas. So compared to the fist-sized spleen, the pancreas is a little bit bigger. It's the size of about your hand, and it's located in your abdomen just behind your stomach. The pancreas is important for your digestion as it makes pancreatic juices, which are enzymes, and it also makes hormones. And the pancreatic juices are secreted to break down sugars, fats, and starches. So, in terms of anatomy of the pancreas, we have the head here in orange, which is hugged by the duodenum, which is in pink here. We also have the uncinate process here in green, and this is a projection for the inferior part of the head. We have the neck in purple, the body in yellow, and we have the tail here in blue. It's also important to note that there are two different ducts associated with the pancreas. The first is the main pancreatic duct, and this begins in the tail. And goes to the head, where it's going to be merging with the bile duct. And the bile duct is just going to pass through parts of the pancreas. Now, both ducts form what's called a dilated hepatopancreatic ampulla, which opens at the major duodenal pala, which is where the bile will enter the duodenum. So overall arterial supply is from the pancreatic artery. However, the head of the pancreas is going to be getting blood from the anterior and posterior superior pancreatic coduodenal and the anterior and posterior inferior pancreatic coduodenal artery. So we have the posterior superior and the anterior and posterior inferior. And both of these are branches of the superior mesenteric artery. Blood is drained through the superior and inferior pancreatico-duodenal veins, large word, which drain into the splenic and superior mesenteric vein. However, most of the pancreatic veins are going to drain into the splenic vein. It's innervated parasympathetically by the vagus nerve and sympathetically by the greater splanchnic from the celiac plexus and the lesser splanchnic from the superior mesenteric plexus. So, to our next accessory organ that's even bigger, we have the liver. So remember, we said that the spleen is around the size of a fist, the pancreas is about the size of a hand, and the liver is about the size of a football. And it's going to sit right under the rib cage on the right side of the abdomen. The liver is essential for digesting and getting rid of the toxins in your body. Fun fact, you actually can't survive without a liver, so be careful. The visceral surface of the liver is covered with a layer called the peritoneum, except for the bed of the gallbladder and the porta hepatic, which we'll talk about in one sec. But the bare area of the liver is actually not covered by the peritoneum and is instead in contact with the diaphragm. So now this porta hepatic that I've mentioned, it's basically a tunnel or passageway for 3 different structures, which make up what's called the portal triad. The first is the hepatic duct, which is leaving, the hepatic artery, which is entering, and the hepatic portal vein, which is also entering. A little mnemonic is help hairless cats. And the liver is also made up of 4 different lobes. So we have the right, the left, the caudate, and caudate means tail, since this lobe has a bit of a tail shape. And then the 4th lobe is the quadrate lobe. It's also interesting to note that the right lobe is actually larger than the left lobe. So if we look at it from an anterior view, we can see the left sagittal fissure, which holds the round ligament. And the round ligament does a couple of things. So first off, it is the fetal remnant of the umbilical vein, which brings oxygen from the placenta to the fetus. It also forms part of the falciform ligament, which connects the liver to the anterior abdominal wall. And it connects the liver to the umbilicus, and it's also a remnant of the left umbilical vein. Now, if we look from a posterior view of the liver, we can see the left sagittal fissure, but now we can see how it connects to the ligamentum venosum, which is the fetal ductus venosum, which shunted blood from the umbilical vein to the inferior vena cava. So in terms of receiving blood to the liver is going to get its arterial supply from the hepatic artery, which is a branch of the celiac trunk. At the porta hepatis, the hepatic artery is going to divide into left and right branches, which supply left and right sides of the liver. And these branches will then further divide within each lobe. And I used this analogy in the last video, but I think it perfectly describes the concept again. So think of the arterial supply of the liver as electricity for a house. So we have our long wire that's running down the street. This is similar to our celiac artery. And then our wire is going to start breaking off and go to different houses. So in this case, our hepatic artery is going to go into our liver. Then it's going to reach the electrical box on the side of the house to enter the house. In this case, this is our porta hepatis. And now imagine that this house is a duplex. So there's really 2 houses in one. So we're going to have the left house and the right house. So some of the electricity is going to go to the left and some to the right. So in this case, this is similar to our hepatic artery dividing into 2 and going into the left and right liver. And finally, we're going to have these electrical wires going into each room within the left and right houses. And this is basically when the branching of the hepatic artery is going to go to each lobe. So in terms of blood leaving the liver, there are the right, middle, or intermediate, and left hepatic veins that drain into the inferior vena cava. The liver is innervated sympathetically by the celiac plexus and parasympathetically by the anterior and posterior vagal trunks. So a bit about these. The anterior vagal trunk is going to consist of fibers from the left vagus nerve, whereas the posterior vagal trunks consist of fibers from the right vagus nerve. And both the celiac plexus from sympathetic innervation and the anterior posterior vagal trunks from parasympathetic innervation are going to contribute to the hepatic plexus. So, last but not least, we have our gallbladder, which is the last organ we're going to talk about today that is relating to the GI tract. The gallbladder is a sac that is underneath the liver, and it's going to store bile produced by the liver, which helps to digest fat. The gallbladder will release the bile into the upper small intestine when it senses that fat is coming. It's going to receive blood from the cystic artery, which is a branch of the right hepatic artery, and blood is going to leave the gallbladder the neck of the gallbladder is going to have blood leaving through the biliary ducts through cystic veins, which then go to the hepatic portal vein. However, the veins from the fundus and the body of the gallbladder are going to drain into the hepatic sinusoids. So there are 3 different nerves that innervate the gallbladder. The first is the celiac nerve plexus, which is sympathetic innervation, and this is where visceral pain is from. The second is vagus nerve, parasympathetic innervation. And the third is the right phrenic nerve, and these are somatic afferent fibers that are responsible for referred pain. So instead of feeling visceral pain, you can actually feel pain in the right area of your body, over the liver, or of your right shoulder. And your gallbladder can also be stimulated from hormones. So specifically CCK, also known as cholecytoconin. That was definitely not how you pronounce it. So when fatty acids arrive at the duodenum is going to release CCK, and this is going to cause the gallbladder to contract and release bile. So basically, it's kind of knocking on the gallbladder's door saying, fat is coming, you need to start releasing bile, and it does this through CCK. So now that we talked about all these organs, let's talk about when things go wrong. So there are some terms, medical terms, that we're going to talk about. For one, we have what's called liver pathology. And this is when we have a bilirubin accumulation in the blood that causes jaundice, which is a yellowing of the eyes and skin. So bilirubin is a chemical substance that is found in bile, and it's produced when the liver breaks down old red blood cells, and it's then removed from the body through one's stool. However, if that's not happened properly and you have too much accumulating in your body, its brownish yellow color can make your eyes and skin appear yellow, and it's very harmful. Next, we have what's called steatorrhea, and this is when you have too much fat in your stool. And this happens when something is wrong with the pancreas and it isn't making lipase to break down the fat. This can cause one's stool to float and to have a foul smell, and it can also cause one's stool to have a pale color. Next, talking a bit about pancreatic cancer, and this is a disease where malignant cancer cells form in the tissues of the pancreas. In some cases, it can block the bile duct and cause the gallbladder to become enlarged. So sometimes this is how people find out that they have pancreatic cancer, when you kind of feel or see a gallbladder being enlarged. You can also detect pancreatic cancer from ultrasounds showing an abdominal mass or percutaneous CT-guided needle biopsy. The pancreatic cancer can also spread to the liver via blood vessels. So this is when it's going from the pancreatic branches of the splenic vein to the splenic vein, to the hepatic portal vein, to the liver. And the pancreatic cancer can also cause mid-back pain, which can be described using the convergence projection theory. So you're probably thinking, how does this in the pancreas hurt our mid-back? And again, this is when we talked about referred pain. So the pancreatic afferents are going to converge with your mid-back afferents on the same dorsal horn neuron, meaning that they share the same segmental innervations. So the nociceptive input from the pancreas is going to travel through the spinothalamic tract to the thalamus, which is going to direct the somatosensory input, and the somatosensory cortex is going to perform a projection error to the mid-back. So it's kind of like broken telephone if you think about it. And this is going to occur because the skin, muscles, and joints are more densely innervated, so these projection errors can occur. The last problem we're going to talk about are gallstones, and this is hardened deposits of digestive fluid that can form in your gallbladder. And this can cause pain in the middle and upper part of the abdomen as well as in the right shoulder. So that was all about the GI tract, all of the organs, all of their jobs and roles, a bit about their structures. We also talked about how blood is received by these organs and how blood leaves, as well as lymph drainage and innervation. And we also talked about when problems happen with these organs. So I hope that you were able to learn a lot. Hopefully you weren't too distracted by my voice, and we will see you in the last assignment.